9 years. That is how long I wore the patch of the Liberty Riders Motorcycle Association. 9 years of showing up, standing shoulder to shoulder, and believing that brotherhood was the highest code a man could live by. The night I laid that vest on the table, our president, Michael Turner, looked at me with steady eyes and said, "You stepped outside the line, Ethan." There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a room full of men who had ridden thousands of miles together, suddenly unsure of where I stood. I was 47 years old enough to know that life is rarely black and white, old enough to understand that sometimes the hardest choice is not between right and wrong, but between loyalty and conscience. As I unfastened my vest, I remember thinking about a question that had followed men for generations. What matters more, staying inside the circle or stepping outside it when someone needs you? What none of them knew that night was this: within 3 weeks, the truth would surface. A breach of trust would be exposed. A legal maneuver designed to strip an elderly woman of her home would unravel, and a 9-year-old girl would return to the only family who had ever truly loved her. In the United States, millions of older adults face financial exploitation every year. According to national estimates, more than half of those cases involve family members. It is a quiet crisis, one that does not make headlines very often, but it is real, and sometimes it happens behind a white farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. This story was never just about one elderly widow. It was about what kind of men we choose to be when nobody is watching. It started on a cool Thursday evening in early October. The Liberty Riders were heading back from a charity ride through the back roads of eastern Tennessee. We were not a large organization, just a close one. 7 bikes, engines low and steady, cutting through the fading right. At the front rode Michael Turner, 54 years old, silver in his beard, calm as ever. I rode just behind him. As we passed a small white farmhouse set back from the road, I saw her. An elderly woman gripping the porch railing with both hands, her shoulders trembling as if the effort of standing had drained every ounce of strength she had left. Her lips were moving. I could not hear her over the engines, but I could read them clearly. "Help me." I raised my hand and signaled Michael. Within seconds, the convoy slowed, then stopped. Engines quieted one by one, leaving only the ticking sound of cooling metal and the rustle of wind across dry leaves. I walked toward the house. Up close, I could see she was not shaking from cold. She was exhausted. "Ma'am," I said gently, "are you all right?" She shook her head. "I cannot move. My legs just gave out. I have been holding on for, I do not even know how long." Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She was 78 years old and lived alone. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier. The nearest neighbor was nearly a quarter-mile down the road. I helped her inside, slowly, carefully. She weighed almost nothing. The living room smelled faintly of old books and furniture polish. There were framed photographs on the mantel, a man in military uniform, a young woman, and a little girl with bright eyes and a crooked smile. I made sure Eleanor had water. I set her phone within reach. I waited until her breathing steadied. "You came back for me," she said quietly. 3 cars passed before you." I did not know what to say to that. Before I left, my eyes lingered on the photograph of the little girl. "That is my granddaughter," she told me. "Lily. She just turned 9. I have not seen her in 2 years." There was a pause in her voice that told me the rest of the story had not been easy. As I walked back to my bike, something stayed with me. According to the National Institute on Aging, social isolation among older adults can have serious effects on physical and emotional health. Standing in that quiet house, I understood that statistic in a way numbers alone cannot explain. The next morning, I rode back alone. No vest this time,
just a plain jacket and a toolbox strapped to the back. The porch railing was loose. A step had begun to rot. Small things, but small things add up.
Over the next 2 weeks, I returned several times. I repaired the railing, replaced a board, patched a section of roof that had been leaking for months. Eleanor made coffee each visit. We talked about her late husband, about the garden she used to keep, about how quiet the house felt now. Little by little, she told me about her son, Daniel Hayes, 45 years old. They had argued about money, about the house. He wanted her to sell and move into assisted living. She refused. After that, the phone calls stopped. "And Lily," she said one afternoon, staring at the photograph, "I do not even know if she remembers me anymore." There was something in her voice that tightened my chest. Years earlier, when I was 24, my younger sister had struggled through a hard season of her life. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. I told myself she would figure it out. She did not. I have lived with that silence ever since. Maybe that is why I kept showing up at Eleanor's house, not because I was trying to be a hero, but because sometimes you get a second chance to stand where you once stayed seated. What I did not realize then was that helping her tighten a railing would eventually loosen something far bigger inside the club I had called home for nearly a decade. I had no idea that the simple act of stopping for an elderly woman would soon test every belief I thought I understood about loyalty, responsibility, and what it truly means to be a man of honor. 2 weeks after I first stopped at Eleanor Hayes's house, the quiet rhythm we had settled into was broken. It was a Monday afternoon, gray skies hanging low over the fields, when a black sport utility vehicle pulled into her driveway. I was inside fixing a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen when I heard voices on the porch. One of them was firm and polished, the other trembled. I stepped toward the window, but stayed out of sight. "Mom," the firm voice said, "we need to talk about your situation." That was Daniel Hayes, 45 years old, clean cut, dressed in a pressed button-down shirt and slacks that did not belong on a gravel driveway. Standing beside him was a woman in a navy blazer, carrying a leather portfolio. Eleanor's voice was small. "I do not need help, Daniel. I am managing." The woman introduced herself as Karen Mitchell, an attorney specializing in elder law. She spoke calmly, professionally, as though this were routine. "Mrs. Hayes, your son has filed a petition requesting a conservatorship evaluation." The word hung in the air like a weight. Conservatorship laws in the United States were created to protect adults who can no longer manage their personal or financial affairs. According to federal estimates, more than 1.3 million Americans are currently under some form of guardianship or conservatorship. In many cases, the system works as intended, but there have also been documented cases where it has been used in family disputes to gain control of assets. I stepped outside then. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, assessing. "And who is this?" "A friend," Eleanor said quickly. "He has been helping with repairs." Daniel's expression tightened. "Mom, you cannot just let strangers into your house. That is exactly why we are concerned." Concern. That was the word he kept using. Karen opened her portfolio and explained that missed bill payments and recent medical incidents would be presented as evidence that Eleanor was no longer fully capable of living independently. "I had the flu," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "I missed one payment because I was sick." Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "If the court agrees," he said evenly, "I will be appointed to manage your financial affairs and make decisions about the property. It is for your protection." But his eyes drifted briefly toward the house, toward the land. Protection was not what I saw there. "You need to leave," I said quietly. "She does not want this conversation right now." Daniel looked at me the way a man looks at a loose thread on a suit jacket.
You are interfering in family matters." "No," I replied. "I am standing in the doorway of someone who asked for help." He gave a thin smile. "This will move forward whether you approve or not. We have a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks." When the vehicle finally pulled away, Eleanor sank into her porch chair as if the strength had left her bones. "He is going to take my house," she whispered. I knelt beside her. "We are not going to let that happen."
But even as I said it, I knew this was no longer about tightening railings. This was legal ground, complicated ground. That evening I went to the Liberty Riders clubhouse and told Michael Turner everything. The room was quiet when I finished. Michael leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Ethan, we are a brotherhood. We support one another, but we are not a legal defense team." "I understand that," I said. "I'm not asking the club to fund anything. I'm handling the repairs myself." "It is not about money," he replied. "It is about exposure. If this becomes a courtroom dispute and our name gets dragged in, it affects all of us." Ryan Cooper, our sergeant-at-arms, crossed his arms. "You've been riding solo a lot lately, Ethan. Makes people wonder where your focus is." "My focus is exactly where it has always been," I said, "on doing what is right." Michael's voice softened but did not bend. "Then do it as Ethan Brooks, not as a representative of this association." The meaning was clear. If I continued helping Eleanor in a legal fight against her own son, I would need to do it without the patch. I went home that night and sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time. 9 years of shared miles, 9 years of believing that the club's code was the highest loyalty I owed. But I kept thinking about something else. The National Council on Aging reports that financial exploitation is one of the most common forms of elder abuse in this country, and that family members are responsible in a majority of cases. If I stepped back now, I would be no different than the men who drove past Eleanor's porch that first day. The next morning, I walked into the clubhouse before anyone else arrived. I removed my vest and placed it carefully on the conference table. Not in anger, not in protest, just as a statement of choice. When Michael came in, he looked at it for a long moment. "You are sure about this?" he asked. "I am sure," I said. "I cannot stand by and watch a 78-year-old woman lose her home without at least trying to help her understand her rights." He nodded once. "Then you do this on your own."
That was the moment the line was drawn. I walked out of that building not as a representative of the Liberty Riders, but as a man accountable only to his conscience. And in less than 2 weeks, that choice would uncover something none of us saw coming. When you step outside the protection of a group, you begin to see how quiet the world really is. The morning after I laid my vest on that clubhouse table, I drove to meet someone I had not spoken to in years, Rebecca Lawson. We had served in the Marines at the same time, though in different units. She had gone on to work as a paralegal, specializing in corporate filings and civil litigation. If there was anyone who could help me understand what Daniel Hayes was building behind the scenes, it was her. We met at a small diner just off the interstate. I laid out everything: the petition for conservatorship, the attorney, the speed with which the hearing had been scheduled. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "If a firm is moving that quickly, someone is paying them well. Elder law cases usually do not escalate this fast unless there is serious money involved." That was the first thread. Within 2 days, she called me back. Daniel Hayes had retained a firm out of Nashville known for high-asset estate disputes. The initial retainer alone was $50,000, paid in full. That number stopped me cold. Eleanor Hayes lived modestly. The farmhouse was paid off, but it was not a luxury property. Daniel worked in regional sales. Comfortable, perhaps, but not the kind of comfort that writes a check for that amount without blinking. Rebecca dug further.
The payment had not come directly from Daniel. It had been routed through a limited liability company registered less than 6 months earlier, a shell entity with no public-facing business operations. "Follow the company," I told her. Another day passed, then another call. "Ethan," she said, "this is where it gets complicated. The company traces back to an investment group tied to Marcus Reed." The name meant something. Marcus Reed was associated with the Black Viper Riders, an organization that had been competing with the Liberty Riders for regional sponsorships and charity visibility over the past year.
Not violence, not open conflict, but strategic positioning. Fundraisers scheduled on the same weekends, public relations pressure, attempts to pull local partnerships away. Why would a competing organization involve itself in a private conservatorship case, I asked. Rebecca's answer was simple: leverage. If Eleanor lost her home, the land would be sold. Developers had been quietly purchasing acreage in that county for a commercial corridor expansion. The farmhouse sat near the projected route. Pressure on the land, pressure on the family, pressure on anyone who might stand in the way. And there was another detail. In reviewing communication logs tied to the investment group, Rebecca found several contacts with someone connected to the Liberty Riders. The name that surfaced was Ryan Cooper. I sat very still when she told me that. Ryan had been with us for 6 years, methodical, disciplined, the kind of man you trusted to keep internal matters confidential. "You are certain?" I asked her. "Phone records do not lie," she said. 3 documented contacts in the past month. It did not fit at first. Ryan had been the loudest voice questioning my involvement with Eleanor, the most vocal about protecting the association from exposure. But slowly, the pieces aligned. If outside investors wanted minimal resistance around that property, discouraging me from helping Eleanor would be the simplest path. Remove the obstacle quietly, make it look like internal discipline. I drove to the clubhouse that evening and asked Michael Turner for a private conversation. I told him everything: the shell company, the investment group, the potential land development, the communication records. Michael did not react immediately. He listened, the way a seasoned leader does, weighing words instead of chasing emotion. "If this is true," he said finally, "it means someone inside this association has been sharing information that does not belong outside these walls." "It also means," I replied, "that Eleanor Hayes was never the true target. Her land was, and discouraging me was part of the strategy." Michael called for a full meeting. No raised voices, no accusations, just facts laid on the table. When Ryan was asked directly about the communications, he did not deny the calls. He claimed they were exploratory discussions about potential event partnerships. But the timing, combined with the financial link to Daniel's legal action, told a different story. Trust, once cracked, rarely fits back the same way. The association voted to suspend Ryan pending further internal review. It was handled through our bylaws, quietly and without spectacle. No shouting, no theatrics. Just the sober recognition that boundaries had been crossed. When the meeting ended, Michael approached me. "You stepped outside the line," he said, "but it appears the line was not as straight as we believed." I did not feel vindicated. I felt heavy, because uncovering the truth does not erase the strain it leaves behind. Yet one thing was now clear. Eleanor Hayes had not simply been a vulnerable widow in a family dispute. She had been positioned at the intersection of money, development, and quiet influence, and the hearing was less than a week away. The next step would not just test her strength, it would test whether the system meant to protect older Americans could recognize when protection was being twisted into control. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, the strain finally caught up with Eleanor Hayes. I was sitting at her kitchen table going over the court paperwork with her when her voice faded mid-sentence. She reached for the edge of the table, her fingers missing their grip, and then she slumped forward.
I called emergency services immediately and rode behind the ambulance all the way to the hospital. The doctors later told me it was a mild stroke, not catastrophic, but serious enough to require monitoring and rest. Stress, they said gently, can weigh heavily on a body that has already carried nearly 8 decades of life. I sat beside her hospital bed that evening. The room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of medical equipment. She looked smaller there, fragile in a way she had never allowed herself to appear on that porch. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thin but clear, "do not let him take Lily." I leaned closer. "Lily is safe," I told her. She shook her head weakly. "You do not understand. Daniel placed her in foster care 2 years ago, said I was not capable of raising her, said it was temporary. Then he stopped bringing her to visit." The words settled heavily in the room. In the United States, there are roughly 390,000 children in the foster care system at any given time. Many of those cases involve complex family disputes rather than direct abuse. But once a child enters the system, navigating the legal path back to family can become difficult and slow. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked softly. She closed her eyes. "Because I was ashamed. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I was too old." There are moments in a man's life when the past presses forward with painful clarity. Years earlier, when I was 24, I had convinced myself that staying silent in my sister's struggle was a form of respect. I told myself it was not my place, that she would work it out. I still live with that regret. Looking at Eleanor in that hospital bed, I understood something I should have learned long ago. Silence is rarely neutral. It is often a choice. I stepped into the hallway and called Rebecca Lawson. Then I called Michael Turner. Rebecca began pulling the foster care documentation tied to Lily Hayes. The records showed no evidence of abuse or neglect, only a petition arguing that Eleanor lacked sufficient capacity to provide long-term guardianship. The same narrative Daniel was now attempting to formalize through conservatorship. Michael, to his credit, did not hesitate. Whatever tension had existed between us, it was replaced with clarity. "If a child is involved," he said, "this becomes about more than association policy." Rebecca filed an emergency motion requesting a review of Lily's placement, citing Eleanor's stable housing, community support, and the questionable financial motivations behind Daniel's petition. The days that followed moved quickly. The court reviewed the conservatorship petition first. Evidence of the shell company's financial backing was presented. Questions were raised about conflict of interest and undue influence tied to the potential land development. Under scrutiny, Daniel's case began to unravel. The judge denied the conservatorship request. Eleanor Hayes was declared competent to manage her own affairs. Next came Lily. Because no abuse or neglect had been substantiated, and because Eleanor's medical evaluation showed cognitive stability despite the recent minor stroke, the court approved reunification under supervised transition. I was listed as co-guardian to provide additional stability and oversight. The first time I met Lily in the presence of a social worker, she sat quietly in a folding chair, her hands folded in her lap. 9 years old, bright eyes, just like the photograph. "Is Grandma all right?" she asked.
"She is resting," I told her, "and she has been asking about you every single day." Her shoulders eased slightly at that. "My dad said she did not want to see me anymore." "Sometimes adults make decisions that are more about control than truth," I said carefully. "But you are loved. Never doubt that." 2 weeks later, Eleanor returned home from the hospital. That morning, something unexpected happened. One by one, motorcycles pulled into her driveway. Not as a show of dominance, not for spectacle. Just men arriving with toolboxes and paintbrushes. Michael stepped off his bike first. "We protect our own," he said quietly, "and sometimes that circle grows." Throughout the day, the Liberty Riders repaired fence posts, replaced warped siding, reinforced the porch steps, and repainted the front railing a clean, steady white. Neighbors watched from a distance at first, then approached with cautious curiosity. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to quiet appreciation. Community, when practiced instead of proclaimed, speaks for itself. Eleanor sat on her newly repaired porch with Lily beside her, a blanket over her knees, sunlight touching her silver hair. She looked tired but not defeated. I stood beside Michael at the edge of the yard. "You think she will be all right?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes, because she is not alone anymore." That evening, as the sun settled behind the trees, Lily laughed for the first time I had heard. One of the riders let her sit carefully on a parked motorcycle, explaining the controls without ever starting the engine. Her laughter carried across the yard like something restored. I thought about my sister, about missed chances, about the cost of staying silent. A patch, I have learned, does not define a man, nor does stepping outside of it diminish him. Character is defined in smaller moments, in quiet choices, in whether we turn toward someone gripping a porch railing or ride past because it is not convenient. In this country, the systems designed to protect older adults and vulnerable children are important. They matter. But they work best when people are willing to stand up, ask questions, and shine light where things feel hidden. If this story speaks to you, perhaps it is because you have faced your own moment at the edge of a decision, loyalty or conscience, silence or action.
I cannot tell you what choice to make. I can only tell you what I learned. Honor is not loud. It does not always earn applause, but it leaves you able to look in the mirror at the end of the day and recognize the man standing there. And sometimes that is worth more than any patch you could ever wear.